Hey, hope everyone's had a good weekend. Let's talk about the suffering contest. You've all probably seen it before. You're at a table, probably after an exam, and the most vocal person among you says, "Man, that was rough." And then someone else wants to chime in and kind of join in the conversation and say, "Yeah, that was pretty rough." And the first guy says, "But that was nothing. I had two exams today, not just one." And the other person says, "Two exams? Bro, I had two, but I had one yesterday as well." Then some third person comes along. "I had three exams today, and I've got another four tomorrow." And then someone else comes in like, "Yeah, I've got all four of those exams too. And let me tell you what, my cat died yesterday. Not only that, but my dog died. And my goldfish went bankrupt, and my grandmother hasn't called me in 6 weeks." And you're like, whoa, you're really miserable. If you pause for a second and think, what on earth is the point of that conversation? It happens all the time. It's usually not that funny, but it happens all the time. It happens in professional life too. Someone says, I've got to take the kids to their football game, and then the person standing next to them says, "Yo, yeah, but I have four kids." And then Supermom over here says, "Well, I have six kids, and they're all in swimming and soccer and martial arts and music and piano." It's ridiculous. And this is a different sort of contest. It's normally we're trying to compete in what are we better at, right? Who is the biggest house, who has the nicest car, who has the most money. But this is a little bit different. And now I'm not saying I'm above it. I've been there before where I'm sitting there and just whining without any check about all the classes I'm in and the work I'm doing and that type of thing. But I've been trying to check myself on that behavior recently. And so the goal of this is just to share some of the insights I've had or the reflection I've had into my own behavior. So where does this come from? What's the goal? Because everyone who participates in this conversation sounds like an idiot. So why do we do it? There's this notion that the ego is always trying to make itself bigger. It's always trying to be right, and it's always trying to win. Now, when you're trying to compare suffering, it doesn't really work. We know from a neuroscience perspective that whether you are, a soldier in a war zone being shot at, or you're a 17-year-old preparing for a high school exam, the physiological conditions that lead to you feeling stressed are very likely identical. So comparing stress doesn't make sense. But on the other hand, suffering is such a nebulous concept that we forget it's not comparable. We forget that just because we are numerically being assailed by more negative stimuli doesn't mean we're suffering any more than the person standing in front of us. And it is therefore very easy to win at losing. It is very, very easy to sit there and play the game with someone sitting across from you about who is having the worst time with it. So that's where the behavior seems to come from, is this ego-based attempt to potentiate itself on the basis of nothing. But what is the healthy version of that conversation supposed to sound like? That's the question. Because I'm a strong advocate for sharing the troubles you have with the people around you, having a small circle of close friends who you can be vulnerable with and talk about the big things and the little things and support each other with the hard things and the easy things. That's what it means to be human. And it comes down to a similar intention that resolves one of two different ways. The most common thing I see is the potentiation of weakness. So, your friend comes along to you and says, "I've got three exams, I got another four tomorrow, I took one yesterday, and I've got to go to work after this." And what's the response? "Oh my God, that's so hard. I can't believe they had such an unfair exam. The homework wasn't even useful." That's totally unfair. Just wait until you transfer. It's way better at SMU. It's way better in med school. It's way better in grad school. The grass is always greener. These are things we say to each other to try to make ourselves feel better, but what we're actually doing is encouraging the weak thoughts that we're having that are making us feel bad. Now, it is one thing to sympathize, it's one thing to empathize and say, "That's pretty rough." But when we go further than that and start unspokenly or implicitly externalizing our locus of control. Here are all the things that are causing you to suffer. Here's all the reasons why it's not your fault. Here's all the things you can't do about it. That becomes a very, very damaging conversation for both parties. What's the alternative? So the second way that this conversation can productively resolve is lending strength. So not potentiating weakness, but lending strength. Person A comes and says, I had a loved one in my family die, and I'm sick, and I've got an exam tomorrow. Life is hard. And you say, yeah, but here's all the good you've been able to accomplish. I know you're suffering, but you're definitely getting a lot done. You focus on productivity. I know you're suffering. I know that it's hard to lose a loved one. I've lost a loved one too. But after having gone through that, I've been able to support my siblings. I've been able to support my students. I've been able to support my patients, whatever your case may be. You're saying, yeah, you're suffering, but you're suffering so that other people don't have to. You give meaning to the suffering. You encourage someone that the suffering is not just something that's happening to you, you got to grit your teeth and bear. It's something that's going to make you better. It's something that's going to enable you to serve your purpose in a more powerful way. You can do this. Not just close your eyes, it'll be over at some point, or just bear with it, or just stop, let go of your idealisticness, let go of your idealism, sorry. You know, compromise. No, be strong. You can do this. That's lending strength. So, what I've learned in contemplating the situations I've been in where I've engaged in the suffering contest is that number one, it's useless. So what I try to do when someone comes to me and they says I'm suffering or I'm dealing with this or I'm dealing with that, I'm like, well, how are you doing it? What are some of the things that are helping you out? What are some of the things you feel are holding you down? It's called motivational interviewing. It's a productive way to lend strength rather than potentiate weakness. I ask them about what's going on with them rather than trying to force them out of it. And definitely, I try very hard not to just let them think there's nothing they can do. No matter how hard the circumstance, there's always something you can do. If you can go out and fix it, great. If you can speak out against it, great. If you can do none of that, but you can at least in your heart feel something is amiss, I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to grow from it. I'm going to change it as soon as the opportunity presents itself. That is a good thing in and of itself. And when I'm the one initiating that conversation, when I have something rough going on, I try not to branch out to the 30 million things that are bugging me to the wrong people. And I always I try to make a point of sharing this with the people I counsel, and I remind myself of it. Is you got to have a couple of people who you trust. You got to have a couple of people who you can tell about all of those things. One or two, that's all. You can tell about all of those things, and you can go to them just to feel like somebody gets it, and somebody can give you integrative advice that pulls from there and there and there and tells you how to helps you manage the whole plethora of things you're dealing with. But when I'm just sitting in class and someone said, "Man, you look terrible today," I'm like, "Yeah, it's been a rough day. I'm struggling with this subject. I'm struggling with, we had to get something fixed at the house. Oh, well, it'll be better tomorrow, man. Thanks." Because everyone's dealing with something. The goal is not for me to convince them that I'm suffering more than anyone else has ever suffered, which is what the ego wants to do. But that's not the goal. So that's probably a bit more of a rant than a lesson. But hopefully what we've learned is the suffering contest happens all the time. We all do it. It's kind of a natural part of life, but we don't need to do it. We don't need to convince ourselves that we're suffering harder than anyone else because that's not the case. It's just biological fact. That's not how it works. We're not better because we're suffering more. And there's a difference between lending someone strength and encouraging their weakness. And I'd like to make one final point. And that is, we have somehow arrived at a societal consensus that suffering is a good thing. That you should go out and try to suffer. that the person who's having the roughest time is putting in the most work. That's not the case. It is possible to be successful, to be wise, to be learning things, to be overcoming challenges, but not be suffering. And it's not a negative thing about a person if they are engaged, if they're undergoing suffering. We all do at some point in time. But we sometimes tend to go out and look for it. When I assess my own behaviors and I assess the behaviors of people who come to me for advice, sometimes I see that I and other people are doing things just because we don't know how not to suffer. We know that that 27 credit semester was a bad idea. But next semester rolls around and we try to do it again. We told ourselves at the end of the previous one we're not doing it again, and then we try to do it again. Why? Because if we think we are suffering, if we think we're doing something extremely difficult, no matter how damaging it is to us, we for some reason feel like we've put in hard work. If we feel bad, if we are physically unhealthy, mentally unhealthy, we think that we're doing something good. And if you happen to be totally on top of things, your life is good, you're working out, you're in shape, you have a great social life, sometimes we feel lazy. But we need to be objective about that. We as a community need to do a better job of feeling okay with feeling good. It is okay not to be going through some rough stuff. And it's okay to be going through some rough stuff. But we need to try not to potentiate that. We need to try not to worsen that and to pursue scenarios in which we make ourselves miserable out of fear of what? That we're not working hard enough? Y'all work really hard. You deserve to feel good. But that's all for today. Suffering is an interesting thing and there's much to be said about it, but let's try not to do it. And let's try to help other people who are going through it. And let's try to learn when we do suffer. And stop competing. That's a separate video. Have a great week.